Welcome to Slow News Day Live. My name is Steve Boykin, and I'm here in beautiful Boulder Creek, California. And I am pleased to be joined this morning by visiting assistant professor of philosophy at Grand Valley State University and also contributing writer to Black Agenda Report and Mint Press News, Patrick Anderson. How you doing this morning, man?
Good, man. Glad to be here.
Glad to have you. I got a chance to let me back up. A couple of weeks back, you wrote a piece for Black Agenda Report that was discussing the similarities between George Jackson and Julian Assange, and I really dug that piece.
Cool.
If we could kind of start by dissecting that article, which I was a complete dick and didn't send to Josh early enough, so I'll have to put it up on the share screen. That would be fantastic, because I'm not even sure if a lot of people are hip to George Jackson.
Yeah, I mean, part of my graduate school training in philosophy was Black radical philosophy, and so while I focus mostly on, I focus on a lot of figures associated with the Black Panthers, specifically Eldridge Cleaver. But yeah, George Jackson's always kind of been in my wheelhouse. And when I was reading Assange's autobiography that was published in 2011, he tells this story where he was reading George Jackson's prison letters. And I was like, oh, so he was like reading Soledad Brother when the Australian feds like showed up to arrest him for some hacking stuff that he did in the late 80s and early 90s. And, as a kid, and so I was like, there's got to be some kind of connection here between Jackson and Assange. So I just started, thinking about that, and that piece is kind of what came out of that line of thought.
And you open it by giving one of Julian's more famous quips, which is, I don't respect anyone who hasn't been to prison.
Mm-hmm.
And it's one of those things where like that works for me because I've been locked up, not prison, but jail, because there is a massive difference. But if you're not pushing the boundaries as a journalist, as a publishing outlet, even as a regular citizen or citizen activist, that's what he's speaking to right there. And the ultimate expression of you pushing those boundaries is to become incarcerated based on what it is you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a definite and very easy to point to similarity between George Jackson and Julian Assange. But also a ridiculous amount of social and civil rights activists and whistleblowers and truth tellers in general.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I also published this piece with Mint Press News about Henry David Thoreau's commentary on John Brown, who was an abolitionist that led the raid at Harper's Ferry, and that ended up, getting him arrested and ultimately hanged. And, Thoreau says a similar kind of thing as Assange does. And he says, in an unjust society, the only place for a just person is in jail, because if you are a just person in an unjust society, you're causing so many problems for that unjust society that they have no other choice but to just lock you up. And I think Assange and Thoreau share this idea. And so in that piece, I explored those kind of connections too, about like, in like Assange's comment within the context of Anglophone civil disobedience theories.
Let's kind of stay on that for a second, because saying goes, if we ignore history, we're doomed to repeat it. But the question that I've been trying to ask people lately is, well, how does that work when history itself is based on a fiction? And you being an assistant professor of philosophy, it seems like a philosophical question. So I'm hoping to get an answer out of that.
Yeah. I also have a bachelor's degree in history, and I almost went to grad school for history. So, you know, like I do philosophy from a historical standpoint, and I do history from a philosophical standpoint, so to speak, you know. And so, like, this is one of the things that I find is interesting about Assange is because, you know, there's no reason to think he's not a journalist doing journalistic work, that WikiLeaks isn't a journalistic website. There's no reason to think that either for legal or sociological reasons, which, you know, maybe we can talk about later. But one of the things that I think often gets overlooked about WikiLeaks is that it also takes itself to be a library. And it's a library for materials that are suppressed, that are orphaned, that are censored in some kind of way. And Assange always talks about, he says, look, there's like basically two justifications for what we do. One justification is journalistic, and the other one is historical. And the historical justification is that, like, human civilization can only be as advanced as the historical record it can draw from. So the more information, the more knowledge you have about what humans have done, the more advanced your society can be. But if you live in a time and place like we do, where very important documents, information about corporate and governmental and military power structures are being suppressed and censored, well, then people don't have information about their surroundings and their environment, so they can't act on that information and advance civilization, you know. And so what WikiLeaks is actually trying to do is say that journalistic processes fit into a larger historical process. It's not just about like, oh, well, I'm just going to tell you what's going on the day, right? The gossip at Capitol Hill and so on, like you might get in Washington Post and New York Times and things like this, CNN. What Assange is really thinking is that journalists are on the front lines of doing history. So, and a lot of times, if you know anything about academic historians, one of their main sources are historical newspapers. So if the newspapers are writing shit journalism, then the historians that rely on those newspapers as primary sources are going to end up writing shit history. And so Assange really sees the connection between journalism and history in a way that I think most journalism, professional journalism, doesn't, and also in a way that I think goes unappreciated by people who are even, you know, interested in WikiLeaks. I think this is one aspect that gets kind of missed is the larger historical record that WikiLeaks is trying to maintain by maintaining its website and the documents that it has.
That's a good point. And we were chatting a little bit before the show about I got dragged into a conversation about WikiLeaks last night while hanging out at a friend's house. And once I started correcting the record a little bit, it was suddenly my fault for derailing the conversation they were all trying to have. And while I'm usually like a little bit more, I don't know, disrespectful when something like that happens to me, in a personal setting, it's a little bit more difficult, I think, but it's also a little bit more fun because I'm an interviewer, so I ask questions, and so half the time I spent it was not necessarily defending the work of WikiLeaks, but asking people just basic questions about what they knew and where they got their information from, and whether or not they believe those sources to be valid on any other subject, you know, and trying to get people to see their own cognitive dissonance in that, okay, well, I don't believe a word that the Washington Post says about A through X, but Y and Z, definitely, yes. This institution that I just trashed, I will thoroughly believe on these things. And it's one of those things where you have to separate someone from their own personal biases and try and figure out why those biases exist. And that then becomes both a historical question and a philosophical question. My dad was a history teacher. I grew up in with two teachers for parents, and so there was an element of like debate encouraged, you know, in the house. and I've found that like people get more, they're either super willing to explore their own biases, or there's no like middle ground with it.
Yeah.
You know, it's either something people are completely willing to look to, or entirely keen to shut down. You know, and as long as they're allowed to walk through life with their own biases, then it's cool, but everybody else should work to shed theirs. And when I really started getting like shut down in the conversation last night was when I vocalized that. Like,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's right, and so like, you know, one of the things I think in terms of our current state of public discourse and journalism in the United States and the way that we talk about it, you know, it's been sort of hijacked by this narrative about fake news, which, you know, in 2006 when people talked about fake news, they talked about The Daily Show and The Colbert Report. And now when we talk about fake news, it's just anything that doesn't meet the nationalistic, imperialistic agenda of corporate and military America. So, you know, so like that's why after the 2016 election, there was this communications scholar who made a list of like fake news websites, and it had things on it like, you know, Black Agenda Report. And, you know, Black Agenda Report doesn't publish false things. They do publish analysis, and they're very open that the analysis that they publish is from a left perspective. You know, but it doesn't make it false just because it's you know, it's analysis coming from a different viewpoint and informed by a different set of values, you know, than your standard corporate media outlets. And so one of the things I think we have to move away from is stop trying to, like, even in my own academic work, like I submit articles to academic journals, and I get reviewer comments back from other scholars. And you know, one time I submitted a paper that was criticizing, you know, establishment or corporate media, like the New York Times and so on. And the feedback I got from one of these other scholars on this article was, you know, that I was being too critical and not praising the good work that's done every day by these journalists, and that I needed to acknowledge the good work that comes out of the New York Times and all this sort of thing. And you know, and then they were saying, oh, WikiLeaks isn't journalism because they're not transparent, which I just found to be the most like asinine and hilarious thing I could have like gotten in response to that. I was like, I read the New York Times almost every single day, and not a day goes by where I don't see an article that says that sources, you know, based on two people familiar with the meeting, or based on someone, you know, a document seen by the New York Times. Well, who are these people? Where are these documents? This is why WikiLeaks' practice of scientific journalism, as Assange calls it, you know, publishing the primary source material that the reporting is based on, then like the reader can actually read the document that the reporting is based on and decide whether or not the reporting is any good. They don't have to take the journalist's word for it. And I think that this scares traditional journalists, professional journalists and editors, because you know, they're used to having a monopoly, or they're like used to being the gatekeepers, right? They get to decide what's in the public interest, and so on. And Assange's view is, look, reporters make information available to the public, but they don't get to decide what's in the public interest. The public gets to decide what's in the public interest, and there might be a debate among the public about what those interests actually are. So, so yeah, I mean, even scholars, you know, you think, okay, these people have PhDs, they're researchers, they've got critical thinking skills, they can, you know, do this analysis, and then at the end of the day, like, they just tell you, like, sometimes they just say what the average person on the street would say, or they give you the same line as you can find in various corporate media outlets. And it's because they're assuming that I don't know what the word for it is, but it's almost like they think, well, I'm so educated that I couldn't be wrong about it, right? Whereas like an average person might be like, well, I don't really know. This is just sort of my view. And so sometimes this sort of attitude among scholars is even more dangerous than that same attitude among average people. And so, you know, and it's especially when it comes to WikiLeaks. You know, I have had other academics say, well, do you think that, you know, WikiLeaks had Trump's tax returns and didn't publish them? I'm like, I don't know. What is this, Schrodinger's tax returns? He both has them and he doesn't until we find out which one it is and open the box. Like, it's insane. Nobody ever goes to the New York Times, like, especially when they're lying about Iraq having WMDs. Nobody goes to the New York Times and says, like, oh, well, like, they knew that, or, you know, they knew that it wasn't the case and they were lying about it. No, they say, well, you couldn't possibly have expected them to get the story right if they were only getting false information from the government. But so there's like this double standard that like WikiLeaks is both all powerful and nothing. And then corporate media is always true, except for when it's not, in which case it's just a mistake. And so like there's this really weird like way the dynamics of these conversations are set up.
I've been able to speak to Cynthia McKinney about the problems in academia in general. And Ray McGovern, who in his breakdown of the Mickey Mat, which is, I don't know if you're familiar with this concept, or if you are, you can shut me up and I won't go.
No, I'm not. I don't think I've heard this.
So, so when Ray McGovern, who talks about what, you know, what is the military industrial complex, he is added onto that, and I'm gonna try and pull it up on my phone. There we go, because I always fucking forget a part. But he's taken the military industrial complex and expanded it into the Mickey Mat, which is the military industrial congressional intelligence media academia think tank complex. And academia is one of those places where institutional security is the reward for good behavior. And good behavior is determined by the people who already have that institutional security. It doesn't necessarily have to do with what is true or what is right or what is wrong, but what the prevailing groupthink of the era is. And it's not like academia is unique in that, you know, I mean, you see it all throughout all facets of professional existence. But it's particularly devious inside of academia because the idea is you are, you know, teaching young people the ability to think critically or to think beyond what they've already been taught. And if what you're doing to quote unquote expand their minds is to give them an entirely different set of propaganda with new parameters to follow, then you're not really teaching them anything. And WikiLeaks specifically is one of those things. Our co-host on the Assange Vigil, Sailor Hudak, who's now with Activism Munich and doing fantastic work there. That was something she had to wrestle with when she was going through her master's program. And the implicit bias that institutions like the New York Times are, you know, God's best smelling fart. But WikiLeaks itself is not to be trusted because they alone have 100% accuracy rating. It's a real fucking head scratcher, man.
Yeah. I mean, like, you know, that's the thing, like, you know, and what's interesting, and, you know, one of the things that I'm sort of working on in my research now is going back and looking at the media discussions of Julian Assange and WikiLeaks as they evolve over time. Because right now we're in a distinctly post-2016 election period of talking about WikiLeaks. So that means that the entire narrative is contextualized within the Russiagate hysteria nonsense. And you know, before 2015, before 2016, people didn't think that, oh, Assange is like, you know, conspiring with Putin and all this sort of, that was never on the table, right? It only came on the table when it started to fit this other narrative, and now it's changed. When you actually go back and look at how WikiLeaks was talked about from 2007 to the early 2010, Assange was mentioned in, I think, the very first New York Times article that talked about WikiLeaks. They mentioned Assange as the editor and founder, and then for all of 2007, 2008, 2009, and the first months of 2010, all the articles about WikiLeaks were in defense of WikiLeaks. They were like, this website is good. A judge issued an order to shut down WikiLeaks, and then 2 weeks later reversed it in 2000. I want to say 2008 or so. And the New York Times editorial board published an editorial about online censorship of journalistic platforms and said, courts shouldn't be shutting down websites like this. And so like now we have, editorials coming out that when Assange was dragged out of the Ecuadorian embassy in London, the New York Times editorial board published a piece that was like, well, maybe this will help us distinguish between like rogue hackers who are threatening national security and like responsible journalists, whatever the fuck that word's supposed to mean. And so like, so you get this shift, right? And so what I'm really interested in going back and looking at is, what are the incidences where you get this kind of shift going on? And a couple other scholars have looked at this question, and two scholars published an article back in like 2014 or so, looking at how media responded to WikiLeaks, and what they called it is they called it the national narrative. So the idea here was something like, as traditional media outlets are threatened by new media outlets, the networked fourth estate, as some scholars call it, online journalism, independent journalists that include things like WikiLeaks, but also like, people with YouTube channels and these sorts of things, as traditional media gets threatened by those. And also while media is globalized, and so American audiences, to take an example, have access to Al Jazeera, RT, BBC, like, foreign media outlets at an increasing scale, then traditional media start to double down on what they call the national narrative. And that is to shore up the relationship between Washington Post and New York Times with the US government and with US corporations, so that they can say, look, we're working as a team with you guys. And even in January of 2011, Bill Keller, who was then the executive editor of the New York Times, published an essay about working with Julian Assange on releasing the Iraq and Afghanistan and Cablegate documents. And he said, he was reassuring the Obama administration, look, we were in New York when 9/11 happened, and we have an interest in getting the same bad guys as you do. And, we're a journalistic enterprise, but we're also, fundamentally an American enterprise. And, that status comes with First Amendment protections, but it also comes with certain kinds of quote unquote responsibilities. And like, that just, shows that Bill Keller's view was like, well, we're first and foremost an American media outlet, and so we are going to be committed to whatever the national narrative is at the time. And you can see this, in the New York Times coverage of Donald Trump, for example. The New York Times has mentioned Donald Trump by name more than any other previous president. Like, they've already talked about Donald Trump more in the last 3.5 years than they mentioned Obama's name in the whole 8 years. He was the Columbia Journalism Review published a study about this, and they're just completely obsessed with Trump. And so you see that because their whole view is that Trump is not good for the country because he's fucking up the empire. And so, he's mismanaging it. He doesn't know what he's doing. He's a buffoon. And so we need, quote unquote, a classy president like Barack Obama to come back in, make all the intellectuals feel better, and then do the same kind of things as Trump does. So like, so the national narrative thing is real. I mean, like, once I found that article, it was sort of, eye-opening and a really good way of tracking what goes on in what we call corporate media.
Is this something that you raise in academia? Do you have conversations with other professors, assistant professors about this? Like what the role of an educator is in terms of either adhering to or trying to, pull away from any national narrative?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I've kind of worked on in the past in terms of national narratives is this question of how the discipline of philosophy itself is informed by a certain version of American exceptionalism. So, like, just for example, in the discipline of philosophy over the past like 10, 20 years, it's beginning to pluralize a little bit, and we're beginning to see more, at least one of the areas I work in, Africana philosophy. So Black philosophers in Africa, the Caribbean, and the United States specifically. And one of the things we're starting to see is, more Black philosophers being taken seriously. But sometimes there's a problem with the way that this is done. So my graduate school advisor, Tommy Curry, he came up with a word for this: epistemic convergence. And what this means is that Black philosophers are only studied insofar as they can be related to white philosophers and therefore legitimized. So you can say things like, oh, well, W.E.B. Du Bois, we're going to study him because he's the Black Hegel, or he's the Black John Dewey, or something like that. But they don't actually study Du Bois for his own sake and in the context of his conversations with other Black scholars and journalists and intellectuals. But I think there's another problem with the way that Black philosophers are taken up in my discipline. And I think this has to do with a national narrative or an American exceptionalism kind of view. So, for example, in the 1850s, Frederick Douglass was one of, the most famous, like, anti-slavery voices at the time. And his view was, abolish slavery, give Black people rights, and use the government to protect those rights, and Black people will be able to flourish. And he has what sort of people would call an integrationist view. Well, one of his contemporaries, an actual friend and colleague, they started a newspaper together. His name was Martin Delany. And Martin Delany said, look, the United States will be racist forever. There's no reason to think that it's going to overcome anti-Black racism. So Black people need to move back to Africa and start a new civilization there with the Africans who still live there. And in my discipline, Frederick Douglass gets tons of attention, and Martin Delany gets zero. And so, and even when he does get, Delany does get attention, it's always like, well, he was like never really clear that he wanted to leave, and sometimes he was about integrating and all this sort of stuff. And so they want to turn him into this sort of postmodern liberal, where he wasn't really sure, and he's a complicated figure. And it's like, no, he just thought that you needed to have a majority population to have any kind of political power. And there was a few times, like in South Carolina during Reconstruction, where he thought Black people could seize political power. And then the rest of the time, he was like, just by sheer numbers, we're outnumbered and we have to leave to have any kind of, political power. And so, but Delany doesn't get talked about because he doesn't tell us a happy story for American progress. He doesn't say oh, if we just do this, then we can become the country we want to be. Delany's like, I don't care about becoming a certain kind of country. I care about getting, freedom and justice for Black people. And so, the way that Delany and Douglass are treated, one of them being shunned by the disciplines, and the other one being accepted, has to do with this, sort of nationalistic narrative, this American exceptionalism. And so, I have covered that sort of that kind of thing. And in my more recent work on WikiLeaks and Assange, the same kind of principle holds. Assange is very cosmopolitan in his outlook. He says, he sort of eschews the think globally, act locally slogan. And he says, no, you should think globally and act globally. That's what we need to be doing. And that's what WikiLeaks does. So, he tries to follow through that with his own projects. And, and I try to explain this, to people and church, even other academics, and try to get them to see it's you're evaluating WikiLeaks based on your identity as an American citizen and your commitment to America as a political project. But if you didn't have that commitment, then you might not have the same view about Assange that you do. And it's a difficult conversation to have because, a lot of scholars think, well, I'm enlightened, I'm past those kinds of particular attachments, but they're not. And and it's one thing if they're just honest about it, and it's a different thing if they try to pretend like it's not there and it really is. So I've just been recently kind of breaking through with those kinds of conversations with my colleagues, not only in my own department or in my own university, but just in the profession at large.
And it's a commitment to nationalism that's entirely self-imposed, but it's self-imposed as a survival mechanism, if I'm understanding it right.
That's a great way to put it.
We have a question from the chat from Sarah Wagner, who mentioned earlier in the chat that Democracy Now! Was emblematic of that transition from media becoming the thing that it originated to stand against. And I agree with that in a number of different ways, and yet at the same time I would still rather watch if I'm going to watch something mainstream, since Democracy Now! Has been accepted into that mainstream fold, I'd rather watch that than something else, but that's my own personal bias kicking in. The question is, what public institutions are still relatively fair and truthful? Because it seems like everything is captured.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is, I think this is a really great question, especially given the sort of protests and uprisings that are going on right now too. It's really difficult to find real independent sources of power and information. One of the reasons that I have been kind of a supporter of WikiLeaks and have tried to change up my research profile and my scholarship and my teaching to cover more about WikiLeaks and related questions around technology, encryption, the cypherpunks, media ethics, journalism ethics, and these kinds of things, is because I found a lot of scholars were getting it wrong, and I thought it was important to talk about because WikiLeaks really is, I think, a great example of an independent information outlet. Now, does this mean that WikiLeaks is 100% objective? No, and Julian Assange would never say that, and I don't think that Sarah Harrison or any of the other personnel at WikiLeaks would say that there's any kind of thing as capital O objectivity in this kind of way. It's really just about thinking about where do people get their money, who supports them, what narratives are they giving, and I don't think that what we need to be looking for is a so-called fair and balanced thing or a so-called objective or neutral news. That's not what it's about. What it's about is understanding how the news is being presented. And there's a couple of examples of ways of thinking about this. So on the one hand, in 2014 or late 2013, when the Intercept was just about to launch, Glenn Greenwald had this email exchange debate with Bill Keller, who was still at the New York Times at the time. And they were debating about what journalism should look like. And, Greenwald had been a longtime advocate of what he calls adversarial journalism, holding powerful economic, military, and political leaders accountable. And Keller was giving this sort of old school, so to speak, journalists shouldn't be making arguments in their reporting. What they should do is just give the reader the information they need to know to make up their own mind. But even in that statement, Bill Keller revealed the fact that there is no such thing as doing what he's saying. How does a journalist know what a reader needs to know to make up their own mind? The journalist has to select facts, right? They have to do something, determine relevancy, and say, I'm going to include these facts in the reporting and exclude these facts from the reporting. And that itself is a value judgment. So even at the level of selecting which facts are relevant, that's a value judgment. So you can't get away from it. And I think this was the point that Greenwald was trying to make in this debate. But a couple years later, I heard executive editor from Black Agenda Report, Glenn Ford, put it far more succinctly, especially from a reader's perspective rather than the professional journalist perspective. And Glenn Ford said, most of the stuff that the New York Times publishes is against my interest personally, you know, as a black man and as someone who has leftist politics. But he says he still reads the New York Times because it's not a question of whether or not to read the New York Times. It's a question of knowing how to read the New York Times. And like, and that way of thinking about it is what I share with my students. That's, you know, sort of the way that I think about news, and so on. And really what it is just knowing what is the perspective the person is writing from, and then that tells you a lot about what's being said. It doesn't mean that there's nothing true in it. It doesn't mean that if you disagree with that perspective, you should never read that that news or anything like that. It just means that it just tells you how to read that information, and that you'll be able to get something different from everything you read. So I use an app called Feedly, which uses RSS feeds to aggregate news for you, and you can organize it any way you want. And I've got liberal magazines, conservative magazines, like right-wing stuff, you know, I've got leftist outlets, I've got, you know, cable news network on there. I've got it all, so I can scroll through and kind of see how the news cycle is covering it, and, you know, different perspectives. You know, you're going to get a different perspective from the Federalist that you get from Reason magazine, which you get from Commentary. You're going to get a different perspective from the Atlantic, and from and you know, sort of more other imperialist liberal kind of magazines, and so on. So you just kind of have to read widely and just know the media landscape in that kind of way. But as far as identifying independent outlets, you know, I mean, I obviously publish with Mint Press and with Black Agenda Report, and so, you know, I'm a fan of a lot of their work. I do think that the perspective they give is pretty independent from the power structures that they're meant to question. But that doesn't mean they have no perspective. But I don't think that that counts against it. That's just the nature of information and news and debate and scholarship and everything like that. And so, yeah.
Well,
so
yeah, you can't. I'm sorry to cut you off, but you can't expect anything, no matter what the fuck it is, to be free of perspective.
No,
like, that's ridiculous. Now there are lines of demarcation that you shouldn't necessarily cross. I've always felt that WikiLeaks operated under the original hacker credo, which was data wants to be free.
mm-hmm, exactly.
You know? And data, regardless of how much Ben Shapiro has corrupted the phrase, like, data doesn't care about your fucking feelings. Data doesn't, you know. If we're kept, you know, and you mentioned those institutions as gatekeepers, and I agree with that 100%. If we're being gate kept by institutions who feel like, journalistic institutions who feel like it's their job to tell us how to feel about something,
yeah,
you know, or what to think or what perspective to walk away with, then they're not doing journalism, they're doing public relations.
mm-hmm.
Which is something that Orwell said too. If you know, the journalism that you're doing isn't making somebody mad, then it's public relations.
Mm-hmm.
And to take that a step further, yes, WikiLeaks has a perspective. Their perspective is, we deemed amongst ourselves that this information belongs in the public because we can document a ton of other releases of this nature that were deemed
Mm-hmm.
to be of public import.
Mm-hmm.
And it's from that perspective that we're drawing upon in order to, you know, really uncritically release. In the earliest drops of WikiLeaks, there was no summary. It was just, boom, here's the fucking data. Run wild with it, Johnny, you know?
Right.
And it got to a point to where they were like, okay, well, if we don't, not that if we don't put our perspective on it, but if we don't provide a summary about what this information is, people are going to get so fucking lost because, you know, the Iraq war logs alone with 470,000 separate documents, or the Iraq and Afghan war logs combined 470,000 documents. I just did a goddamn teach-in about this. I should know the fucking numbers. Oh, and you had mentioned in our email correspondence about the teach-in videos that we should be dropping the second one this week. But the goal behind that, the idea behind that, is not necessarily to have it become university level teaching material, but just to kind of cram as much accurate information into a mini documentary format as humanly possible, and then do a series of them where you could put them all together as one giant documentary, or you can have it, parceled out in a way that's a little bit easier to digest.
Mm-hmm.
And the first one, obviously, who is Julian Assange? It's just, rough background and what his charges are and what those charges stem from. The second one we're going to be releasing relates specifically to the Chelsea Manning documents that he's being charged for, gives some background on Chelsea's story. The next one will be Deconstructing Russiagate as it pertains to WikiLeaks, which is something that, oh my God, dude, like I've almost given myself hemorrhages slamming my head into a wall trying to explain to people like why Julian Assange is not both simultaneously being handled by Vladimir Putin, yet also an agent of chaos. And it, do you have any thoughts on that? Could you sum up in any way? I'm trying to put you on the fucking spot here, but like, if you have had this experience where you have to explain the farce of Russiagate to people as it pertains to WikiLeaks, have you done that? Is there a way that you explain it? Because I'm a fucking long hair in the woods. I do not have degrees. Sometimes shit needs to be explained to me.
Mm-hmm.
More often than not, explained to me.
No, man. I mean, yeah, I've had this conversation about the Russiagate stuff with a lot of people, and I've talked about it in my classes and things like this. And when I talked about it in my classes, it was before the most recent revelations where the guy from CrowdStrike said apparently in the congressional testimonials, okay, well, we have this. We see that Russia did infiltrate the DNC servers, and then we just don't see the information exfiltrated. So we don't have like the concrete evidence to show that like this computer took information from this device over here. That's the missing part. And of course, Adam Schiff apparently have been lying about that for 2.5 years. So so I talked about it in my class before that. But I did draw upon, Ray McGovern and what's the organization that he's in?
VIPS, Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity.
Yes. So I used Ray McGovern's analysis of this to show that like, well, there's all these questions about where the documents came from and how do you test it and how do you look at them and so on. And there's questions about the download speed, meaning that like the emails were downloaded to a jump drive rather than, exfiltrated across the internet, which would have been much slower and all that sort of thing. And so I tried to raise all these things, in my class about 1.5 years ago for students, just so I could show them like, look, here's an example of an article from a New York Times report that just states as a fact that Russia stole these emails and delivered them to WikiLeaks. They just state that as a fact, right? Because like the intelligence agencies have, asserted that this is true. And then I showed them these other reports by like Ray McGovern and all these things. And I said, look, there's all sorts of possibilities here, right? One is that there was an internal leaker who did this, and this is based on some forensic evidence about the download speed. Another possibility is that Assange hacked into them and got the emails himself, but that would be completely inconsistent with his what we might call like the hacker ethic that he has in the book Underground, co-written with Sulet Dreyfus. Assange and her, they talk about the Australian hacking scene in the late 80s and early 90s, and one of the principles was you don't steal anything from the systems you are able to break into. It's kind of like a state park. You leave it as you found it. And so it would be like a complete violation of this like lifelong principle that Assange had for him to steal them. It's possible, but still like not likely. Then there's other possibilities, like for example, the CIA and the Vault 7 publications that WikiLeaks put out in April and May of 2017, showing that the CIA themselves could have in fact left traces of Russian computers in the DNC servers to spoof this whole thing. So like it's also possible that that's the case. And so, you know, there's just all these possibilities, but we haven't seen any concrete facts and reports. And the things that we did get was actually misinformation, was lies about these like congressional testimonies that are now out, and you know, just show that, oh, the smoking gun piece of evidence that was claimed to have been there was never there in the first place. And so, so yeah, I have spent some time talking about this, and but like I said, you know, people would much rather have a simple narrative of like, well, of course, Assange is just being duped by everyone. You know, he has no agency, you know, this kind of thing, or, you know, he actively likes Russia because he's a right-wing authoritarian, and, you know, all that kind of stuff, which, you know, the people who say these things have never read a single page, a single word of anything Assange has written. They don't watch his interviews. They don't read his interviews. They don't know anything about that. They don't know anything about his connection to the hacker movement of the 80s and 90s. They don't know anything about his participation in the cypherpunks. They know nothing about it. And so, you know, it's based on complete ignorance. And that's why, you know, I always tell people, like, if you want to like have some context and be able to say this sort of stuff, like, here's a stack of books and articles, you read those, then you come back to me and tell me how your claim can be reconciled with that information. And, you know, no one ever takes me up on it because it wouldn't be possible.
That's good shit. It's a shame that Cypherpunks is out of print, because it's one of those things where I would love to just go stand downtown Santa Cruz and just pass out copies of Cypherpunks. Like, I think that needs to happen. Cat Terrell, thank you for the super chat. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
There was something that I had. Oh yeah. One of the things that I try to remember to discuss whenever CrowdStrike is mentioned, whenever that particular piece of testimony that you were just talking about is brought up, is that Sean Henry, the guy who made those statements, no, we didn't see any exfiltration, went on to make the most cartoonish statement I've ever heard in fucking released court transcripts, where we didn't see anything, but we believe it based on what we've seen. You what? You believe what you saw based on what you didn't see because it's what you saw? Are you the fucking Marx Brothers here?
I know.
Sean Henry is one of two people who is has been more or less proven to be the FBI handler of the hacker Sabu, who was the guy who flipped on Anonymous and got most of the Lulzsec crew rolled up.
Mm-hmm.
So CrowdStrike was Sean Henry's present for being a good FBI handler and helping to bring down or at least severely cripple and then throw into a state of decade-long paranoia the collective of Anonymous. I wonder if that's common knowledge. And if it's not common knowledge, I would like to figure out a way to get that information proliferated into the segments of the populace where it would best be utilized, academia being one of those.
Yeah. I mean, you know, I don't think it's common knowledge. I've you know, come across, you know, that same you know, sort of trajectory of his professional career, but only in independent media circles. So you see people like Aaron Mate or Max Blumenthal report on these kinds of things, and you see some YouTubers reporting on these kinds of things. But it's not the kind of thing that CNN's going to talk about. It's not the kind of thing that MSNBC, NPR, New York Times, Washington Post, they're not going to talk about these kinds of things. And so if that's where most people are getting their news from, you know, they're not going to have any idea about this, and they don't have a reason to look it up. you know, because the story oftentimes fits some narrative that they're committed to. And so, like, you know, because it fit the reality that they believe exists, there's no reason for them to dig beyond that. And I think that comes back to your question earlier, where we were talking about whether or not people are willing to sort of interrogate their own beliefs and values, and to sort of, you know, be open to critically challenging them and to letting others critically challenge them. And I think something like this, you know, would be just considered so esoteric from many people's point of view that they're not really interested in that. And that's one of the things that I have a problem with the way that WikiLeaks is discussed and written about, is that it's always viewed, you know, I mentioned earlier, from a very narrow nationalistic point of view, but also from a narrow partisan point of view. So like the Republicans who hated WikiLeaks in 2010 and 11 for sabotaging the American empire loved him in 2016 for supposedly sabotaging Hillary Clinton's campaign. And the Democrats, who in 2010 and 2011 were sympathetic with WikiLeaks exposing, you know, Bush-era war crimes, in 2016 thought that he was just, you know, like a Kremlin operative or whatever the fuck people say about that, you know? And so like, it's all just like whatever's immediately going on in the moment, whatever the feels are, like, you know, we're told something and we just go with that. And, you know, and this is one of the reasons that I'm increasingly interested in information and communication systems, because, you know, we live in an age where, like, our information and communication ecosystems, our media ecosystems, shape the possible consciousness that we can have. And so if you preclude, you know, certain kinds of things from the discussion, I mean, people call them all sorts of things, like Chomsky and Herman call it manufacturing consent and having a narrow window for debate, and other people call it Overton window and these kinds of things. But if you can shrink the terms of the debate down, then you can preclude all sorts of kinds of thinking. And most people don't even realize that that's happening to them. And, you know, the philosopher Slavoj Žižek, he puts it really well in this one essay about WikiLeaks. He says, when the means of our unfreedom are presented to us as the very means of our freedom, that's when they're the most dangerous. So like this idea that, oh, well, you live in a democracy, you can vote, oh, we have the First Amendment, free press, so you're informed. When those kinds of things are presented to you as the means of your freedom, yet those are the things that actually keep you from being free, you become ideologically committed to, wedded to the systems that keep you unfree. And so I think, you know, I think there's a lot of that going on in our sort of so-called information age, or whatever.
I take Chomsky's manufacturing consent to a new place now. Jared Beck helped me get there. My at least most of my audience is familiar with this concept, but I'll lay it on you nonetheless. Chomsky posits that the media's role was manufacturing consent. This was in 1989. We are now 31 years removed from that, from the publication of that. He wrote that pre-internet. I personally believe that the role that the media plays now, and when I say media, I, you know, generally mean mainstream legacy establishment media, the role that they are playing now is to manufacture confusion. And we've got shorter and shorter and shorter news cycles. We've got multiple sides of essentially the same argument. And that argument is America good, everyone else bad.
Yep.
And we've got all kinds of people who are utilizing the internet, which is the greatest repository of human knowledge on the planet in existence, to find their bubble, and then to build a comfortable home inside of that bubble, and then put up a big giant wall on the interior of that bubble that they themselves can never fucking leave. So instead of taking a vast repository of knowledge, they have hand selected a perspective and chose to plant their flag on that perspective and defend it to their death. This creates one of the most easily manipulated populaces on the fucking planet. because all you have to do is play to a bias and you've got somebody. And that's it's about the opposite of what this show tries to do in terms of and I guarantee you that's reflective partially in a lower subscriber count, because I'm not here to confirm anyone's bias. I'm here to present the people that I think are interesting people to talk to, and then to ask them questions and have them answer those questions to the best of their ability. And that's it. That's the whole fucking show. You know, it's not here. Let me spend 8 months telling you why Bernie Sanders is the shit. You know, or, you know, in some cases, 4.5 years of telling people why Bernie Sanders is the shit. That's not my gig. There's plenty of people that do that and they're successful at it. I don't, that ain't me. But the manufactured confusion is something that I do like. I personally believe in the concept of it, not just because I sort of came up with it with Jared, but because the more I thought about it, the more I was like, well, fuck, you know, that's not just a clever turn of phrase. That's what we're living in.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that's a really great way of, you know, putting it. I think there's even a way that, you know, the manufacturing consent model that Chomsky and Herman put forward, does entail also some kind of manufacture of confusion, you know, even back then, even before the internet age. And I think that that's really what it comes down to. And again, this is why, you know, WikiLeaks is so interesting, because what they want to do is take documents that are suppressed, censored and so on, make them publicly available, but also permanently available as research libraries, for example. And so I think, you know, I think that's important. Also, in terms of this manufacturing consent, manufacturing confusion discussion, Matt Taibbi's recent book, Hate Inc., also does an update on the manufacturing consent model, the propaganda model, and he calls it manufacturing dissent, where he's saying like what you actually had before like the late 90s was everybody wanted to appeal broadly to all media markets, right? But then as those became like sort of balkanized in the 90s following the communication reforms under Reagan and Clinton, what you end up getting is rather than trying to appeal to broad audiences, trying to find some subset of the population that is your target audience and building up that media market. And so then Fox News kind of pioneers this, but MSNBC does it in its own way. And by doing this, he's saying that like the media actually is the source of what sometimes people are calling now like the divisiveness or whatever, and it's because of the changes in the political economy of news media, and so and it's all based in advertising. So yeah, I think this is really interesting, and I think this is another reason that WikiLeaks is important, because when you start to think about like, okay, this is what the government says in public, and then you have documents that show what government officials say amongst each other in private, right, behind closed doors. They aren't engaged in public relations. They aren't engaged in censorship. They're not engaged in propaganda or manipulation when they're speaking to each other. So the stuff they say to each other, you know, as the theory goes, is more honest, right? It gives you a better idea of what actually is going on behind the scenes, and I think that, you know, that model of using information leaks to against these institutions, I think that model of, you know, activism and journalism and whatnot is actually very insightful given the historical period that we live in, and the importance that information and communication have for our social organizations, especially in sort of like North America and Western Europe.
I think it's inarguable to try and say that WikiLeaks doesn't have a place in our current history and the history of the last, you know, 10, 12 years. And particularly because of the way that their own work has been weaponized against them. You know, you see this throughout periods of history where somebody will write a book that then becomes banned or burned, and then 30 years later, that particular book or series of works is held up as something to be lionized. Um, I don't want to wait a generation before people start looking at WikiLeaks and the content that they produced as something that needed to be studied and needed to be talked about.
Mm-hmm.
It's my fear that we are living through the biggest press freedom trial of our lifetimes under a near total media blackout.
Mm-hmm.
Which
would be a celebration when it is covered.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But like that on its face should have most people wondering why, the media outlets that they trust aren't covering it, or are only covering it in a specific way, and that specific way is always to denigrate the outlet.
Mm-hmm.
But I find far too often that blackout carries over into independent media, or quote unquote independent media, and you'll have YouTubers whose main gig is political horse race channel. Well, in 2016, they couldn't shut up about WikiLeaks because they called out Mother, and they called out the entire Democratic establishment. So it formed the baseline material for your content 4 years ago, but now they will refuse to talk about it, or talk about it as little as humanly possible, not because the information suddenly became irrelevant, or not because WikiLeaks stopped publishing. They haven't. But because their personal bottom line is directly affected by the content that they produce, and if that content includes WikiLeaks, they lose pennies on the dollar every single time that they report on it. The way that we monetized thought happened all wrong. If you were to ask me personally.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that the monetization of thought on monolithic platforms that have seed money and in-QTEL is the way that we should have gone about this. This is why I like the Rockfin. The Rockfin is more or less a decentralized platform where you can express your opinions without fear of losing advertising, based on what you said. I really hope that fucking that Rockfin is what helps kill YouTube. Trying to see if we got any questions in here. I do have to run. We've been at it about an hour. Somebody's kicking around Noam Chomsky, which is fine, dude. Like, yeah, nobody. You shouldn't agree with somebody 100% of the time. You shouldn't. Like, and Chomsky, to bring it back to what we started talking about in terms of academia, has that institutional security. He has enjoyed and prospered off of that institutional security, and he can be an accepted gadfly because of it, as long as he doesn't tell people to vote third party.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I actually have an academic friend who, in 2016, they're a Green Party member, and so they vote for the Green Party. They do events for the Green Party and things like this. And in 2016, when they were doing events, their university contacted them, saw that they were, speaking about the Green Party or something somewhere, and contacted the university. A representative from the university contacted them and said, you know, you really need to like make sure that you're careful about what you say because you're a representative of the institution and all this sort of stuff. And, you know, like that blew my mind because, you know, academics can go out and like canvas for Hillary Clinton and like write all these pieces for her and all these sorts of things. Nobody's ever going to tell them not to do that. And this time around, you know, we've got, you know, Joe Biden, and academics can go out and make all these arguments for why you should vote for Joe Biden, X, Y, and Z. And no one's going to say anything, anything to them. But, you know, if you say, oh, you should vote for a third party candidate, then, you know, your institution comes and yells at you. I mean, we have like scholars in my discipline who still study, and like they study Martin Heidegger, who was a Nazi philosopher, and they call themselves Heideggerians, right? Followers of his philosophy. And like, and they're awarded tenure based on the research they do. And then you have people who go out and say, hey, maybe you should vote for a party that is going to like help save the planet and like reduce militarization and end wars and things like this. And they're like, well, you should maybe watch what you say. So it's like this really weird double standard going on about how that kind of thing is managed. But yeah, and in my particular position, I'm a visiting assistant professor, which means that I don't have tenure. I'm not even on a tenure track. So, you know, like it might come at one point where people are like, oh, well, you do all this stuff about WikiLeaks, but we don't like that, so, you know, you just got to go. And I might like get kicked out of the, you know, like not like formally, but just, oh, well, you know, no one's going to give me a tenure track position or something, just because I do research on WikiLeaks, I do research on black radical philosophers like George Jackson that, you know, that like they don't like. And we talked about this as sort of the top of the show, like, you know, whatever the prevailing consensus or like overall view of the institution is at the time is going to determine who's chosen and who's not. And you know, and just by talking about things like WikiLeaks in a positive, fact-based, you know, and you know, oftentimes supportive way, you know, that might be enough to catch me enough flack with the profession that to preclude me from ever kind of attaining that tenure track sort of situation.
Yeah, no, I mean, you're absolutely right. And that's the fucking shame in it. Before we wrap, tell people about the website that you're working on, that we're putting together, because I want to be able to direct them to it.
Yeah. So, in addition to the website, I did want to just say one thing about the cypherpunk stuff. And that is, like, one of the things that people get confused about in terms of Julian Assange and WikiLeaks is, especially in 2010, the word radical, or the term radical transparency, was used. And then people would go, well, isn't it kind of weird that WikiLeaks is so secretive, even when they are calling for radical transparency for others? It sounds like a double standard to me. And like this, you know, this continues to this day. And it was actually originally a criticism made of the cypherpunks in the 1990s. But the cypherpunk slogan, or motto, if we can, the main principle of the cypherpunk movement is privacy for the weak, transparency for the powerful. Like, and that's why the cypherpunks, on the one hand, advocated the use of encryption. So like using Tor browser, or, you know, some people use Bitcoin, or like Signal, or any of these kinds of things, making sure that your communications are encrypted using VPNs, so that your communications won't be monitored, or it will make it very difficult to read and monitor your communications. But on the other hand, they advocated transparency for large organizations. So John Young, who's another participant in the cypherpunk movement, has a website called cryptome.org, and Julian Assange had a blog on there in 2006 and 2007, and John Young's been publishing government documents the same way that WikiLeaks does for a long time. And so, you know, WikiLeaks, the transparency for the powerful, that's what WikiLeaks is really doing. And so it's really a manifestation of that cypherpunk movement, and that's one of the things that I'm sort of now starting to write about in my research and organize. As for the website is called wikileaksbibliography.org. So it's 100% distinct from wikileaks.org. It has nothing to do with WikiLeaks. I've never met Assange or Sarah Harrison or anybody, and my website doesn't host any documents that WikiLeaks publishes because WikiLeaks already hosts those documents. My website, WikiLeaks Bibliography, is meant to be a resource for people who are interested in reading about WikiLeaks and doing research on it. And so right now, like the way that the website is set up is that there's a section of primary sources, and it will be a list of all the things that Julian Assange has written. And then there will be another section for things that have been written by other WikiLeaks personnel. And then eventually I'll have a section with interviews collected and linked and so on. Then there's a section of books, and this will be books about WikiLeaks, written by everybody from journalists to academics and so on. And then there's an academic bibliography of pieces that will be published in academic journals. And then WikiLeaks in the news, that's sort of going to be a long-term part of the website. And what I'm working on right now is going through and archiving every New York Times article about WikiLeaks over the last 13 years and putting them in chronological order. So people can actually go back and read the New York Times coverage of WikiLeaks and see the different kinds of changes that go on in the coverage. And I'm starting with the New York Times, but I plan to do The Guardian, Washington Post, and maybe a couple other major news outlets. And then I might have another page where I just have like some important reports from various outlets, you know, not have it be so comprehensive, but just, you know, important reporting from them. And then there's a section about films, and that'll be documentaries and so on about WikiLeaks and Assange. And then the last section of it is the researcher guides, and that's one of the things I've been working on this weekend, and I'm going to try to have those up this week sometime. And they'll just be primers, like reading lists. So it'll say, like, for example, I have one that'll be a cypherpunk reading list, and it'll be like, do you want to understand who the cypherpunks were and how Julian Assange was influenced by his participation in that movement? Well, these are the few books and articles that you should read to like have a grasp of that. And or are you interested in Assange's understanding of scientific journalism, right? What he calls what WikiLeaks does. Well, here's a few articles and interviews that you should read to get a handle of what he means by that thing. And so I'm going to put together those, and I'm starting with just a few of those researcher guides, but I plan to add a lot more in the future. And I put the website live yesterday. So if you go to wikileaksbibliography.org, it'll redirect you to the WordPress site that I'm using for it. So, but by the end of the summer, it'll be up and running with all the subdomains and everything like that. So it looks kind of like, you know, under construction at this point, and it is. But I wanted to get it up so that, you know, any viewers who are interested would know about the website, could go to it, and then know that, you know, by the end of summer, it should be up in about 95% functioning and filled in with all these sorts of things. And of course, my university email is on the website. So if anybody had questions that they wanted to email me with in the meantime, you know, please feel free to do so. I'd be happy to point you in the direction of you know, any good sources, videos, readings, or otherwise that I can, if you know, there's things that you're interested in about WikiLeaks, or if you want help trying to make points about WikiLeaks to other people, like what can you point those people to, and what are the good resources for that. That's really the reason for the website, is just so that I can sort of take the academic work I'm doing, make it available to the broader public, and so that journalists and citizens, you know, in the US, around the world, will have access to these kinds of things and be able to understand WikiLeaks beyond the very superficial narratives that we get from corporate media.
Hell yeah. I wish you nothing but success with that. I do. It looks like it's going to be one hell of a resource. I do have to run. I had promised some time in my day-to-day to Nico House, and he's blowing up my phone. So it looks like now is that time.
Cool, man.
Thank you so much, Patrick, for coming on, having a conversation. We're gonna have to get you on the Assange vigil here soonish, and I will work with you on scheduling for that as well. And one more time, real quick, let people know where they can find your stuff and where they can find you. And thank you again. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, so my faculty page will be in the philosophy department at Grand Valley State University. The WikiLeaks bibliography website, wikileaksbibliography.org, will be sort of evolving over the summer and, hopefully coming to fruition, by August. And in addition to that, I also have articles at Black Agenda Report and Mint Press News, so you can check those things out there. And of course, if anybody just wants to get a hold of me and chat about this stuff, email me at my university email is the easiest way to do that.
All right, man. Patrick Anderson, thank you so much. That's going to do it for this episode of Slow News Day. Let's see. Yeah, look for me live on Nico's channel here shortly. And then we will see you Tuesday for the Free Assange Vigil, 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central Pacific. Jesus, fuck. Garland Nixon will be joining us, and I'm really looking forward to that conversation. And until then, y'all, good luck to us all.